Hey Geekscapists, I'm sitting here with Blake Harris, who wrote this book, Console Wars. It's all about the early 90s battle between Sega and Nintendo. Nintendo ruled the video game industry with an iron fist, but Sega wasn't going to be put down. It's a David and Goliath battle, and this book chronicles the entire thing. It's worth picking up. Tell us.
This is the epic battle in the video game landscape, that shaped everything that what we have today, and also shaped my childhood, your childhood. Anybody between 20 and 40, it totally affected their lives.
So what gave you the idea to write this book?
The idea to write the book was really because I just wanted to read the book. My brother gave me a Sega Genesis 3.5 years ago for my birthday, and I picked it up. I hadn't played it in about 15, 20 years, and it brought back a flood of memories, and then also just reminded me what a big part of my lives video games used to be, and how much that defined my childhood, my friendships, and every social aspect of my pre-teen self. And nowadays I love reading nonfiction books, business books like The Smartest Guys in the Room, Disney War, and I wanted to just read about what had been going on behind the scenes. I figured we were just kids. There must have been all sorts of crazy fun influencing what ultimately affected our lives. And I went to a bookstore, looked for the video game history section, did not exist. I looked for then just one of the books on video game history or on Sega Nintendo, and they didn't have a single book in stock. I thought that was very weird that there's a film history section, a music history section, and for an industry that's $60 billion, there's not a single mainstream book in a Barnes & Noble. And then from there, I just sort of started doing research, ended up getting in touch with Tom Kalinske, who was the president of Sega of America from 1990 to 96. And after I spoke with him, I knew I wanted to spend the next few years working on this project because I saw that Sega and Nintendo, these big global icons that completely influenced culture, pop culture, and everything. There was now a face to the story with Tom and some of the people he had told me about, and it's been an extraordinary ride, 3 years plus, and I hate to give it up.
What was your biggest discovery in writing the book?
I never realized how close Sega and Sony were to releasing a joint hardware, which would have been the equivalent of the Sega Playstation. And I never really realized at the time how dominant Nintendo was. I mean, as a kid, I knew they were sort of like the Coke to the Pepsi. They were the long-established market leader, but I didn't realize they weren't actually that long-established and that they had over 90% of the market and just controlled everything.
Right. In 5 years, they become 90% of the market.
Yeah. The coolest thing for me is, the way I wrote the story was to appeal to an audience of gamers and non-gamers alike and really focus on the David and Goliath aspect of it from Sega's perspective. But I loved the idea that 5 years earlier, Nintendo was their own David in a David and Goliath struggle of resurrecting the video game industry. And in that time, to your point, they just became gigantic. Mm-hmm. They had over 95% of this $3 billion a year industry. And more than that, they just controlled every aspect, the developers, the third parties, the retailers, just everything. It was amazing. And that was also part of their undoing, how much control they had and how much control they exerted.
So how close did we actually come to getting a Sega PlayStation?
Incredibly close. It very well could have been, instead of the Sega Saturn, Sega would have released the Sega PlayStation. And what it came down to was cultural conflicts between Sega of America and Sega of Japan. And that was sort of the beginning of the end for Sega and Tom Kalinske's reign at Sega of America, where once he had been empowered and given the mandate to do what he wanted and to build the relationships he wanted, and as Sega of Japan exerted more control, that was one of the ways that they did, and it was sort of cutting off the nose despite the face to some degree, and we were stuck with the Sega Saturn.
Was there a jealousy, you think, in seeing Sega of Japan actually being the parent, but all of a sudden Sega of America is the one that's actually having success?
Absolutely. I mean, I was just looking at the numbers again the other day. There's a Harvard Business School case study on Sega that was from 1995, so almost 20 years ago, but it had statistics about Sega of Japan's success or lack thereof in that market, and they never even had more than 15 or 20% of the Japanese market, whereas in America, Sega of America eclipsed Nintendo by 1993, at one point almost got up to 60%. So we know Sega Nintendo is this big charge battle that defined our childhood, but in Japan, it's sort of just
like
an afterthought.
In Japan, they're like the Vita.
Yeah, exactly.
I was like, what? You had a Genesis? Why did you have that?
From a business standpoint, we like to think one company, of course they could work together, they have the same name on their offices, but as a human I can understand why the people that are actually designing the games, or most of the games, and designing the hardware would feel jealous to some degree that their stuff is actually selling better in a country where it wasn't created. And I do think that created a large amount of jealousy that dictated the direction of the company.
Kudagari, the story of him creating the PlayStation in secret because Sony didn't believe in putting all that money into a console business when Nintendo had so much of the market, etc. That's a great story. How he went and basically created the PlayStation 1 on his own.
Yeah, I mean, Sega, as I just mentioned, really suffered from this civil war between America and Japan, but they were not unique in that necessarily. Nintendo of America and NCL, which was Nintendo Corporate Limited in Japan, also had conflicts, and Sony, as you were just saying, Ken Kutaragi, completely to his credit, went on his own and sort of disregarded what his supervisors were saying at Sony, because they too, in Japan, were not into getting into the hardware business, whereas in America with Olaf, they really were, and Kutaragi spearheaded the entire effort and, thank God, made it happen.
So this book's going to become a Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg movie.
It's going to become two, actually. There's going to be a documentary that I've been directing with my business partner, Joe Natulis, and Seth and Evan are attached to write and direct the feature film adaptation of the book with Scott Rudin producing. So that's like a dream come true for me. That's the ultimate dream team.
It's crazy.
It is absolutely crazy. I wake up and then remember and I'm like, oh yeah, today's going to be a good day. Prior to writing the book, I did not know Seth or Evan, other than that I loved their work, and sort of on a 1,000,000-to-1 shot, I asked my agent to send over my book, an early draft of my book proposal to them, and it made its way up the ladder, and miraculously they liked it and wanted to meet with me, and in January of 2012 I met with Seth and Evan for a couple of hours. We really hit it off. We talked about Seth's time getting a Power Glove, which really impressed me.
It was so bad.
It was so bad. And they got back in touch with us later that day to say they wanted to produce a documentary and also be involved with the feature film, and ended up they wanted to write and direct it.
Okay, so what are your top 5 Sega Genesis games?
All right, well, I think that it's really hard to talk about the Genesis and their success and how much fun it brought me and those my age without mentioning Mortal Kombat, which was the biggest game in the history of games, and to me it's still just like every time I see it and think about it. I remember, back then arcades were still somewhat popular, and arcade games would be in pizza places and the like, and my brother and I used to play Mortal Kombat at the pizza place, Pizza Pizzazz, and it was like the arcades were almost like the minor league system for the consoles, and the best games would get brought onto the system. Everything was tended to be exclusive for one system or the other, but this was one of the first games to be released on both consoles on the same day. And the Sega version had the blood, which you could enact through the blood code, and the Nintendo version had green sweat, which was kind of ridiculous, but kept with their family-friendly atmosphere. And the Sega version outsold them 5-1, and that was really the straw that broke Nintendo's back, at least for that time. So my second favorite game from that time would be Echo the Dolphin, which was, it was basically created with the premise of Sega wanting to offer different types of games. Wherever Nintendo zigged, they wanted to zag, and they just wanted to offer the experience of what it would feel like to be a dolphin. So I don't think that the game or the story itself is revolutionary, but I just remember how viscerally enjoyable it was to control a dolphin and to use Echo's sonar, and also to spend hours and hours trying to figure out what to do, because
the game was not self-explanatory.
I was like, where am I going?
You're just going around going, meow. Yeah.
So maybe it could deserve like a revision of the story. But the gameplay, the actual control was so fun, and one of my favorites today to even replay. Joe Montana Football. Sort of in the early days of Sega, before Tom Kalinske really took over and before Sonic gave them that identity and that mascot, they tried to buy their mascots with Tommy Lasorda baseball and Pat Riley basketball and Joe Montana football. And the star power didn't necessarily bring them the success they wanted, but the gameplay of this one, combined with Joe Montana being the biggest, star athlete at the time, really helped Sega. And what I always loved about this game nowadays, knowing, is that basically this is just John Madden football with different sprites and like kind of changed graphics, because Sega was planning to release Joe Montana football in Christmas 1990. They got screwed by their developer, and they ended up scrambling, and they wanted EA to give them Madden. EA wouldn't, because they believed that there was a strong franchise there, but they got EA to design the game for them and use the Madden engine. And I spoke with some of the developers at EA, and they basically set out to make a worse game of John Madden football. And they would even, while they were developing this game, come up with cool things and be like, oh no, we should save that for the next Madden.
Yeah.
And amazingly, this game sold as well or even better than Madden. So that just goes to show that it's not always the gameplay, it's the marketing.
It's technically a worse game.
Yeah, it was designed specifically to be a worse game, and it actually sold better. So, I mean, if that doesn't define what Sega was and how great they were at selling their products. I don't know what else does. Sonic 2. What is there to say?
That's obviously has to be in the top 5 of any Sega Genesis list.
Yeah, I mean, Sonic 2 and the relaunch at Sega, Sonic Tuesday, was a large part of the book, just because it really changed the way that video games were released. It was the first game that had a global launch. It had a street date where, like a movie today, you know, oh, this movie comes out on June 6th. And back then it was like, this game will come out June-ish, or in early June, or it'll come out to KB Toys this week, and then it'll come out to Walmart next week. But Sega really established sort of the blockbuster mentality of the video game industry, and having hard street dates and big press leading up to a launch. You know, they had a very specific teaser program where, okay, they would show, they wanted to reveal that they had a side character, but they didn't want people to know his tail, so they showed him from behind. So you kind of got a sense of what was going on, and they did a lot of great stuff with the graphic work, which is one of the other reasons I like it. And it's also, I think, just the best Sonic game, and they're all pretty great. And then last but not least, the greatest game of all time, not just for the Genesis, but for life.
The greatest game of all time.
NHL 94. I mean, it's just like digital poetry. I can play it for hours. You know, as much as it is fun to check people and to score goals, I feel like there's just a figure skating aspect. It's just so fun to glide and play through.
It's like a casual game.
Yes. And, you know, I think it probably also didn't hurt that I live and grew up in New York, and the Rangers were in the Stanley Cup around this time. So there was like a lot of like, oh yeah, hockey's actually a major sport. I should get into that. But
that's as far as you got.
Yes.
You never actually strapped on the skates. You were like, it's too cold. I'm playing this.
Too cold, too expensive, but I did get the game. I started collecting the trading cards, and then the Rangers lost, and I was like, I'll just play the video game. That's enough
they
for
win
me.
every time in the game.
But I love this game. Unfortunately, unlike the version in Swingers, it does not have the blood, which interestingly happened because they couldn't get the license from the league, so they got the Players Association license, and since it wasn't licensed from the league, they felt like they can use the blood. Another fun backstory. That was the best part about this project, that every rabbit hole I went down led to 6 more rabbit holes. And you know, for the book, even though it's kind of long, I wanted to make sure it was a really quick read and had a narrative focus. So I worked to try to shape it as much as I could, but there's still so much that I couldn't put in there that's just great stories but didn't really fit into this narrative. So hopefully I'll get to talk about them, or I'll get to write some articles about them, or someone will write a book about NHL 94, because I would read that book.
There you have it, folks. The top 5 Sega Genesis games from Console Wars writer Blake Harris. He's the authority, so you have to believe him that those are the top 5 Sega Genesis games. If you guys disagree with Blake, go ahead and put it in the comments. Let us know, what were your favorite Sega Genesis games, or did you prefer Nintendo and go out and get a Super Nintendo instead? Let us know in the comments. Obviously, we're going to have tons more about video games on the channel, so subscribe. And Blake, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, one last thing, if you don't mind. You know, my favorite part about this project, aside from the great story, is that 95% of the time when I talk to people about it, it brings up personal memories about their own console experience. You know, I loved your story. I sent your stepmom a book because I loved it. How much you associated Sonic with
everything,
your stepmom. And so maybe in the comment section, it'd be great too to hear about people's console experiences, how they chose between a Sega and Nintendo, or if they got both, if they were one of those few weird kids that had both, or, you know,
yeah, who are those rich kids?
Yeah, any personal anecdotes are great. Please share those as well. Would love to hear them, interact with you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, of course, man.
We're talking more, buddy.
The book is called Console Wars. It's in stores now. Now Blake's going to sign mine.